world is changing fast. New technologies are impacting how we think about products, services, and the way we live our lives. Nowhere is this trend more present than in financial services, where new business models and customer expectations are changing our conceptions about banking, finance, and the very nature of money. Welcome to Rebank, a visionary podcast about banking, fintech, and the future. The future of banking is here. Hello and welcome to Rebank. I'm your host, Will Beeson. Today we're thrilled to be joined by Usama Fayyad. Usama is the CEO of Open Insights, a US-based data strategy and technology company. Usama also serves as CTO of Stella.AI, a Mountain View, California VC-funded startup, and as Interim Chief Operations and Technology Officer for a new innovation-focused division of MTN, Africa's largest telecommunications provider. From 2013 to 2016, Usama was Chief Data Officer at Barclays, one of the UK's biggest banks. He remains active in UK banking as a special advisor to the board of Nationwide, the world's largest building society. From 2004 to 2008, Usama was Chief Data Officer at Yahoo. Usama holds a PhD in computer science and engineering and holds adjunct professorships and university advisory positions on 3 continents. As always, connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, or on our website at bankingthefuture.com. Thanks so much for listening today. Please welcome Usama Fayyad. Usama, welcome to Rebank.
Thank you. Good to be here.
You've been involved in a number of data-related businesses and roles. Can you please describe your work over the past few years, both in banking and more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, my deeper exposure to banking started probably with Barclays. Before that, I've worked with banks, but as an outsider. Joining Barclays as an insider at the group level gave me great exposure to the whole set of businesses Barclays was in, from retail banking to business banking to corporate to investment banking to the Barclay card, credit card, and to the Africa business. The work there concentrated mostly on, I would say, more on cost savings efforts that ended up dealing with automation. A lot of processes in some of the large banks are still manual, certainly compared to technology companies. So many transactions happen manually. Many adjustments and cross-checks and so forth happen manually when computers are able to do them much faster, typically much more accurately. So we did a lot of work that involved utilizing machine learning to think of it as crowdsourcing from our operations colleagues. So I had technology folks and I also had data operations folks reporting into me. And what we would do is we would have algorithms watch how the colleagues are doing the work and automatically figure out how to automate it. Sometimes 80% of the task is automated, sometimes almost 100%, which of course results in dramatic speed ups of anywhere from 6 times to 60 times faster, which is great cost savings, but more importantly, higher accuracy, more accountability, more lineage for the data, less room for error because people type in numbers and often will type in the wrong account number or the wrong amount. Also, there was a lot around data governance, trying to standardize what's happening inside the enterprise. How do we get the various parts of the bank to speak the same language from a data perspective? How can they use the same data models? How do you migrate them from the traditional, very expensive data warehouse appliance and commercial database systems to the new generation of open source? We did a lot of Hadoop, moved a lot of data onto Hadoop, and there's a lot of economic drivers really for the Hadoop big data technology. These are separate from the technology capabilities. These are basically summarized in the fact that a data warehouse appliance compared to a Hadoop data store costs about 20 to 50 times more. So, I'm unaware of any organization that has a diminishing appetite for storage. Every year, people want more. And in many cases, these costs are basically not sustainable. Hadoop amazingly gives a great solution for that. I was at Yahoo when we were designing Hadoop, and before we released it out to the open source. A lot of the things that it's really funny that we were criticized for architecturally turns out to be a huge strength economically now. Data is usually a mess because people build a lot of apps, and the typical design of an app, the app developer will say, I need an app database. So I'm going to grab data from whatever data sources there are. I'll create my own database and I'll tune it for performance. And I'm running my app. Multiply that by 100 to 5,000 to 10,000. And now you've got the explanation why people are running around trying to explain, which one is the right version of the truth. Why do we end up spending 100, 200 million on the risk function trying to figure out where the real exposure of the bank is? You end up spending hundreds of millions on the finance function because they're trying to chase down which data is right. In an architecture like Hadoop, where you have plenty of processors living with the data, it brings a whole new architectural domain where you can bring the apps to the data. You don't have to move the data. You don't have to create another database. And then there's a huge element of cost saving that comes from what's called ETL, extract, transform, and load. Very expensive software that banks typically spend high tens of millions of dollars a year in licensing costs to companies that just do this extract, grab data from your database, transform it, load it into another database you own. It turns out Hadoop and big data platforms are very, very flexible and capable of doing this stuff much, much cheaper, for free basically, and much more efficiently, and over a larger domain of data sets, including unstructured data, voice data from the call centers, video data from the ATMs, and so forth. So it's a whole new regime that opened up by introducing sort of very cheap open source data.
Wow, it sounds like you've been working on some really mammoth issues at these organizations. Barclays most recently. The company that you run now, which I think you started and ran before Barclays, Open Insights,
yes,
solves large data problems for organizations across sectors. I know you've done work in retail, telecom, marketing, banking, and more. What are the biggest challenges large organizations engage with you to address?
Yeah, Open Insights is a company I started right after I left Yahoo. And it was instigated because at the time Microsoft was pretty determined to sort of have me come back. And I wasn't ready to quite come back. I love the company a lot and I had a great time at Microsoft. But I ended up speaking with Steve Ballmer. He convinced me that, you should do some strategic consulting with me and Satya Nadella, who's now the CEO. He used to be the SVP of the online division at the time. And that started the company basically thinking about the data strategy, meaning, what do you need to do with data to sort of monetize the businesses properly, leverage the data as an asset. And of course, part of this is doing diagnostics. What are you doing wrong? What kind of talent are you missing? What kind of systems are you missing? Why are you doing it in a very expensive way? How can it be done in a different way? And back then, this is 2008, a lot of the technology companies were suffering from, they didn't get big data correctly the first time. It was very expensive. And it took them a good decade to sort of, get it to be very efficient, in fact, super efficient now. And companies like Microsoft itself, now that it took it to the cloud, but also Facebook, and who actually took a very innovative approach to developing their platform by crowdsourcing that design. But Google certainly is the one that's been the longest in that space and sort of developed a lot of the engineering that made big data possible and economical. So the kinds of problems I look at I really like to summarize them as data strategy and, more importantly, big data strategy. How do you do it from, getting the right systems in place, getting the right architecture in place, getting the right team in place, all the way to what does it mean for the business? How should the business think about these data assets? And often, a lot of these businesses are sitting on some very powerful data that they typically don't think about a lot. If you think about it, the telephone companies, they were sitting on the largest social networks in the world. They just never thought of them as social networks and never tried to leverage them as social networks. It took the internet and the likes of Facebook and LinkedIn and so forth to sort of start thinking about these things as social networks and referral networks and so forth. So there's a lot to be done to effectively teach or help businesses on this data journey, getting them to a level where they really can get on top of their data. The reason there's a lot of demand in that space is there's very little talent that understands the space. The talent is pretty much absorbed by the top data companies, the top internet companies. So everybody else is left in a scenario where they need a lot of help.
We often hear about the power of data. To date, we've managed to capture huge amounts of data, but we haven't always been able to glean predictive insights from it. What are some of the tangible opportunities available to banks if they can efficiently capture, store, and process large volumes of data?
One of my most, I'd say, crystallizing experiences at Barclays was when I realized the power of having access to payment information. So to begin with, let's start with the basics. Banks talk a lot about KYC, know your customer. And they think of KYC as a regulatory requirement. You must do it, you have to do it, it's a hassle, collect documents, keep copies, make sure you meet the regulator's need. If you think about it from another angle, KYC is saying the law is actually giving you the right, in fact it's demanding, that you know the customer's age, actual address, actual workplace, source of wealth, source of income. A lot of things that, when I was in the internet space, be it working with Microsoft or Yahoo or Google or whatever, I would have killed to have that kind of access to that kind of information. And what's funny is, we spend all sorts of resources on the internet space trying to infer and estimate that data indirectly, and banks are sitting on it. It's at their fingertips, but they never actually thought about how do I take this dynamic of thinking of KYC as a requirement and turn it into actually CRM. So how can I move my business based on this knowledge that I have? Payments data give you so much information about not what people think or what people are interested in, but what people actually are doing. So I can infer how much you drive from how much money you spend on petrol. I can infer how much you eat out, not infer even, I know how much you spend on eating out, how much you spend on different areas, and I'm talking here about sort of universal banks that have a credit card and a debit card. Barclays is a beautiful example because in the UK, if you take the retail bank, the debit card, and in the UK, the consumers like to use debit cards typically more than credit cards, although that's changing. If you take Barclay card, and then if you take the point of sale machines, a bank like Barclays gets exposure to easily over 60%, between 60 and 70% of all transactions happening in the UK. One of the things we did at Barclays is, for example, take that data and create the MP reports. So for each member of parliament, we'll automatically generate insights into their districts. What's happening? Are people spending more money on, fast food restaurants, more money on expensive restaurants, more money on petrol, more money on insurance, where do things, energy, etc. And of course, those kinds of insights, those we offer at an anonymized level to the MPs, and they love it. But there's versions of that we try to launch to small businesses. There's definitely versions that we did with the corporate bank. And these give amazing insights into what's happening. So for banks, as far as I'm concerned, the opportunity is cross-selling, upselling, servicing the customer better, predicting what the customer will do or will want to do. I'm very fond of a couple of, actually 3 case studies that came out. What's funny is they came out at Barclays Africa first in the retail bank before even in the UK, but we built the platform for the UK retail bank. This was a big data platform that allows real-time streaming and sort of notifications and actions, decisioning, predictions. So one of them, an application that I really like, was in Barclays Retail in Africa, where the algorithms will predict in real time what's the likelihood that you will go into overdraft. And as soon as we predict that, we will send you an SMS message that says, well, you're about to go into overdraft. We think you will go into overdraft in a week or in 10 days. Click here to do something about it. Now, in an SMS campaign, normally if you get a 1% response rate, that's reasonable. If you got 2%, that's like amazing achievement. The response rates on these campaigns were 60%. So, and more importantly, the NPS, the Net Promoter Score, which is what we use to measure how happy customers are with us, were way up there in terms of the score. So that gives you an example of how once you get on top of that data and you're able to action it and couple it with predictions, you can quickly launch a lot of these things that add a lot of value to the consumer and help the bank drive a much better relationship. Africa also launched one where they do personalized credit limits. So as you're spending money, you'll actually get an SMS in the moment saying, we can increase your credit limit by, whatever, 1,000 Rand or 10,000 Rand in South Africa, and click here to accept, right? Again, the acceptance rates were pretty huge. There was another campaign that we did to sort of encourage people to use the digital channel more than the branch. And the beauty there is the ability to act real time adds tremendously to the effectiveness of the message. So if you go by the classical way, if I detect you went to the branch and a week later I sent you a notification saying, hey, Will, you could have done this, not at the branch, but, online or on the mobile, probably would be not relevant. If you got that message while you're doing the task, it will really register much more because you're in the act and you'll get it and it will stick. And we actually measured that. So a lot of these examples are examples of how sort of the data goes actionable. We had a lot of action on the back office, which is not visible, but resulted in huge reductions in cost, in risk and finance. We also cleaned up a lot of the data that resulted in basically fixing a lot of the capital ratios of the bank, which is something the banks are very sensitive to. So banks are sensitive to the quantity known as RWA, risk-weighted assets. And if you don't do a good job of capturing and netting out these assets, they can actually severely hamper your ability to sort of have the right amount of capital. So we did a lot of data cleaning there to using the big data technology to achieve, I think with Barclays we did in 2000, for the year 2015, we recovered about 12 billion pounds of RWAs, which is huge. It actually enabled Barclays to exceed its goal for the core equity tier 1 ratio, which was a goal we published to the street. And Barclays set a goal for that year to take it over 11%. And that was really enabled by just, data cleaning and a lot of this data technology.
Wow, that's fascinating. So as someone who's directly involved in capital calculations for a new bank, that is phenomenally relevant.
Well,
wow.
For a new bank, you don't have a lot of the issues that the older banks have, where a lot of the legacy gets you because you can't, you may have contracts that should net out against each other. They don't. You're overbooking capital all the time. Mm-hmm. Hopefully, as you're building your new bank, you can avoid a lot of those mistakes from the beginning.
Yeah, well, speaking of legacy issues, in the context of those examples, the African case studies, how much background work was required to make the data available to deploy those SMS campaigns?
Yeah, one of the things we did, so not only did we introduce open source, we actually introduced Agile development methodology. And the ratio I like to use is it's a documented ratio in banks that if you go from the traditional waterfall approach to development where you write the design documents and then they get approved and then you do the development and it takes a long time, then you go through testing, then you finally launch it to the market. By the time you launch it, you've basically missed the mark in a big way. It's probably irrelevant. The market has moved on. With Agile, you do a lot smaller increments and you do them fast and you take them to market quickly. So the ratio I like to use is by going from waterfall to Agile, people have actually measured that organizations like banks will be twice as efficient in their development effort. Now, I think they could be a lot more than that, but that's a good enough number. I'll take it. If you leverage open source and you leverage the new platforms for development, you can go about 10x faster. So if you take the 10x and multiply it by the 2x, you get a 20x speed up. And this is what these big data teams were able to essentially move at a speed of 20x the traditional speed of development in the bank. And by the way, that means the cost is way cheaper because we don't also rely on heavy licenses or anything like that. It's most of it free or just small support fees. So we were able to do these things very quickly. So a lot of these projects basically took 2 to 5 weeks to go from, we got the idea to we actually launched it. And we do it as a pilot, we try it, we get feedback, and then we iterate over it, and then we have the final product. So that methodology really works. And, Silicon Valley, everybody does agile development. In banks, this is still a new thing.
So that time frame would suggest that the data is there and it's available if it's kind of processed correctly.
Yeah, well, the data is usually there. The problem is, how do you get to the data? How can you figure out what the data means, especially if you're dealing with legacy systems? So what we found, we launched things in parallel. So I had a whole team that was doing just data governance and data architecture, trying to figure out how to fix the legacy world. But what we did well was build the new world, sort of in parallel, without trying to fix the legacy, where you figure out where the data sources are, you pull them out, you make sure whatever you're doing is well governed and clean and so forth in order for it to be sustainable. And by the way, that's the biggest danger. I always tell my teams, with big data, you can get very big messes, much bigger messes than you could get with normal relational databases. So what we did was always think of it as we shunted the data over into an alternative mechanism to delivery. Anytime we got involved in the legacy to try to make the legacy system do what we wanted to do, we definitely moved a lot slower and we met a lot more resistance. So I think it's easier to build a new world and try to leave the old world alone until you're stable enough where you can say, I can now confidently tell you can switch off the legacy systems.
So you think that for large multinational banks, the strategy is likely more start to develop new things, manage to the extent possible the legacy issues, and slowly kind of shift from old to new rather than looking to transform the old?
Yeah, I think trying to fix the old, this is my personal opinion, but if I were to do things over again, you waste so much energy trying to make such small changes in the old. Whereas if you use that same energy building in the new, you could be building a whole new bank. So to me, I think that's the approach that I would take anytime. Now, what I say, I recognize fully, and I come from a 325-year-old bank, is perceived to be very dangerous. By some perceived to be sort of even irresponsible. How could you build something new? It will take us a long time to trust what's new. And I think it took a long time to educate people that it's the old stuff you trusted wasn't that great. In fact, the thing that used to help me the most is the fact that a lot of the fines that would hit the bank would come from the old systems being opaque, difficult to understand, difficult to decode, couldn't explain the data lineage, couldn't explain where the data came from. So a lot of the regulation sort of started driving the banks into basically the brave new world of big data and sort of modern systems. So yeah, I'm a strong believer of that, but it's definitely not the common belief in banking.
Some fintechs aim to leverage customer data, historical transaction information, user profiles, geolocation, and more, to create predictive banking experiences that dramatically improve on current offerings. The goal is compelling, but I sense the dream is further away than we think. How do you think about what's possible in fintech in terms of leveraging data?
I think so. The data today sits with the financial institutions. I think the best chance is not to try to do it from scratch, but figure out how do you quickly plug in, and preferably plug in parallel, just like I described, where you can effectively add capabilities to the bank without requiring a major disruption or disturbance to the legacy systems. So you figure out light ways to plug in, enable the pulling of that data, and enable the ability to actually drive value from it. I think the opportunity is huge. I think the biggest challenge, it's not really technical. The biggest challenge is a psychological and a market challenge, right? To get the banks, the large insurance companies. And by the way, the insurance companies are much faster than the banks at embracing the fintechs. With banks, and that's typically because banks have larger teams typically and larger legacies and so forth. I think if you figure out the right way to plug in, you can make things happen faster and easier. The unfortunate thing that I see is a lot of fintechs sort of approach it as in, we're here to disrupt, we're here to change, you guys didn't know what you're doing. And it creates a bad dynamic, which makes it more difficult, ironically, for the fintechs. One of the things we try to do at Barclays through our Barclays accelerators, the reason we helped these accelerators, we funded the space for them, we paid for the management fees for Techstars to manage the whole process. We didn't invest in them directly, but the idea was to give an incentive to our colleagues to engage with startups and learn that they're not bad things, that they are innovative. So we used to reward our employees for mentoring startups in the accelerator, and we would give a bigger reward if you actually had the courage to issue a contract to a startup, with the hope that kind of approach would slowly change the culture in the bank to say, you don't really have to make contracts with the big guys. The smaller guys can be much more innovative. It's okay to do it. We can celebrate you doing it. And we realize every once in a while there'll be a mistake and things won't work out. But, a lot of the fintech startups have to understand that bankers, by their nature, they abhor risk. Their raison d'etre is to eliminate risk. And they still view change as risky. And that's one of the cultural changes I try to sort of instill, is to sort of say in places like Silicon Valley, you got to embrace change, because if you don't change, you die. So no change is very risky. And if the fintechs were to get sensitized to that fact and figure out, what is the safest way I can explain this technology as something that has extremely low risk but potentially high upside, they may have an easier way to get in there. But I do think, looking at the whole space, it's a huge, huge opportunity.
Through your work at Open Insights, you work across sectors. It'd be interesting to understand the way some of the other major traditional industries are dealing with data issues. Would you have any thoughts on that, and maybe case studies that you may have been involved in other sectors that you might want to share?
Yeah, it's probably, I can share some of the older case studies. It's difficult to share the newest ones, of course. But I'll tell you in terms of categories. Let's talk about telcos, right? And in fact, this is a good topic for telcos and fintech, right? People have suddenly realized that, not surprisingly, if you're a wireless operator, not only do you know what a bank knows in some cases, you know more even, right? So a customer may declare their address to be one place and their workplace to be one other place. If you're a telco operator, you pretty much know where this person is spending, 8 hours a night. You pretty much know where they're spending most of their day. It turns out something I've seen actually in the developing world, the activity, even on a prepaid customer where you don't have much data about that customer, you're not sending him a bill, they have to prepay, and all you know about them is minimal. They just, their SIM. It turns out that the top-up behavior, a lot of the mobile payments that are happening with mobile money and mobile wallets and so forth, give you data that allow you to do much more accurate credit that banks can do than sort of the traditional incumbents, the credit card agencies and so forth. You get much better insight. It's very behaviorally oriented. It's built on access to other data sets beyond sort of, what you've done historically. And we have data that shows actually that that's more accurate. And there's a whole bunch of fintech startups that are trying to help telecoms translate that data into effectively credit scores that can get used by others. That will enable all sorts of new lending opportunities. Mobile payments enable micro lending, micro payments, things that you cannot do at a bank simply because the cost of a transaction is so high that you cannot really go below a certain level. Whereas with micropayments, the infrastructure is new, the cost is low. You can go arbitrarily to, fractions of a penny on a transaction and you'll be fine. So there's a whole new world when, these companies that never thought of their data, a telco never thought of its data as a great source of, credit scoring. In fact, they used to buy credit scores. And if you go in the UK, if you try to buy a new phone, that's what they'll do, is they'll try to check your credit before they issue you a phone. And they're querying sort of the traditional carriers versus, that behavioral data gives you an amazing ability to score much better than that traditional credit bureau, as an example. I'm seeing a lot of interesting things happening in the space of IoT and IIoT, the industrial Internet of Things. A lot of very exciting things happening, and even in areas I never predicted, like agriculture, dairy farming. I often speak about this, public case study I use for the Japanese cows that wear the pedometers. And you'd wonder why a cow would be wearing a pedometer, but it turns out that by measuring the steps, not only can you tell the health of the cattle, but you can also predict when a particular cow is ready, for example, for artificial insemination. And the case study I use from Japan as an example, which actually blows my mind, it turns out that the detection rate for estrus in a dairy farm in Japan is about slightly less than 50%. And that results in about a 40% insemination rate. Now, for a farmer, this is a huge lever. Like if you could double that or increase it by 50%, it makes a huge difference in the profitability of the farm. Turns out, utilizing big data, and this is a case study that Fujitsu did with some Japanese farmer, and then Microsoft got involved. From the steps that the cows take, you can actually very accurately infer and give a 16-hour prior notice to the farmer saying this particular animal is ready. So, and 16 hours from now is the optimal time. They were able to take the detection rate to something like 90%. And what's even more fascinating in this particular case study, it turns out that if you act at 16 hours, that's the optimal time. But if you act just before the 16 hours, you're more likely to get a female baby. And if you act just after the 16 hours, you're more likely to get a male baby. And I think of this and I say, wow, this is a farm with 5 to 10, 15 people on it. And they're utilizing big data, Internet of Things, and analysis to automate a lot of stuff that is hard to do. The key to this one, it turns out that cows, when they are in estrus, they take a lot of steps, but at night. And unless you're a very motivated farmer, you're not going to stay up all night to figure out which cow is taking a lot more steps. But if you have a cheap pedometer that costs a few dollars, that information comes automatically to you and you can act on it.
Wow. Think about the information that Fitbit has on us now.
The ability of a lot of the wearables, and I know, Fitbit and others went through that fad where people thought that they're going to be doing a lot more. I think they didn't capitalize on it enough. It wasn't valuable enough just to tell you, well, here's a report on how well you sleep, and here's how many steps you took. Of course, the mobile phones started counting steps, and that changed the market. But that ability to have wearables that can measure all sorts of stuff about you. I happen to be on the board of a public company called InvenSense in the US. They basically make all the accelerometers and gyroscopes that are in most smartphones that you can think of, in all of the wearables pretty much, and a lot of the drones and so forth. And it is phenomenal how much information you can measure on a chip that really only costs 50 to 80 cents. The sensors will measure the acceleration so they can count steps. But not only that, if you have accelerometers in different directions, you can actually have the equivalent of a gyroscope, which means now you can do navigation without necessarily having a GPS signal, because you can do dead reckoning, right, as you're walking. So there's many, many, many things. I mean, in fact, trivially, one of the reasons why you now have all these cheap toy helicopters that can fly and be stable is actually because of these very cheap gyroscopes that you can put on a chip and sell for under $1. So there's a lot that can be enabled in terms of very smart sensing that will tell us a lot about shopping behaviors, health, at a much deeper level, because you can also measure temperature, you can measure sound, you can measure all sorts of things that today are not leveraged yet. So I think it's a whole brave new world that will come in terms of health and human life.
With things like behavior analysis and user profiling, you mentioned the MP reports that Barclays was preparing to help politicians better understand their local districts. I've read some articles lately, fascinating, scary, about targeted marketing through the likes of Facebook to help sway voters in US elections or Brexit, things like that. Are there ethical concerns around gathering data in order to create customer profiles, and then what's done with those?
Yeah, I mean, it's huge ethical concerns, and I think very good stuff is happening now with PSD2 and with GDPR, which is the new data protection set of rules that are coming out of the EU that basically spell out. So first of all, to me, it's not a technology issue, it's a policy issue. We simply just don't have the right law and the right policies in place to properly govern that utilization of the data. And an example of that, sort of gone awry is the whole world of behavioral targeting on the internet with the ad networks. On every page you see at a publisher on the internet, there's probably 100 to 1,000 ad networks. They're all competing on which ad to show you through an automated auction that's happening in the background without anybody realizing it, all happening in 50 milliseconds. But the point is, those are examples of technologies that actually track you across sites without necessarily your knowledge and disclosure. However, what I think is a very elegant solution, and I think this is what's happening with GDPR especially, it's all about opt-in. If you get meaningful consumer opt-in, and it's important to say meaningful because many people just say yes to the license agreement or whatever and move on, and they don't know what they're giving away. But real meaningful opt-in means you understand what you're giving. You're getting something in return, something tangible that you understand the value of. And you have the right to go examine what data is being kept about you. And you have the right to edit that data because it's data about you, meaning delete, etc., the right to be forgotten. Some companies do this very well. The example I use in the offline world where, to help people understand, how well this could work is the frequent flyer mileage points, right? If I go to fly, even though, I don't necessarily need the points, I'll go out of my way to say to the, person at the desk, hey, make sure you have my frequent flyer number. In fact, if I'm flying with my children, I also want you to track my kids too, right? Because I value the points and I understand, and they send me reports and it's very clear to me what data they collect about me. Now, when you think about it, that data is really private, right? Where am I flying from? Where am I landing? When am I landing? Potentially where I'm staying in a hotel. Very, very private information, but I'm willing to share it because I think it's worth it and because there's a clear opt-in. I think that's the mechanism that we need to shift towards. And that's not happening with mobile and internet and social networks at the sufficient level of understanding by the consumer. So we need those laws that will essentially enforce the providers to explain to the consumer what's happening and convince them to practically opt in because there's enough value back to them.
You operate at the cutting edge of data science. Where's the industry going? What are you most excited about over the next 10 to 15 years?
I think data science performed over the unstructured data. So things like voice, video, chat, images. In general, I would call it areas where you need to use these very sophisticated, often involving a lot of artificial intelligence, machine learning, etc., entity extractors or signal extractors from raw data, and then doing the learning on top and the data science on top is a whole new domain that will enable a lot of really cool things, potentially scary things, but cool things, because you can now actually truly harness the power of data to overcome the lack of knowledge that we have. So, we navigate the world based on sort of the best knowledge we have in our heads. It turns out that often we don't have very good knowledge and, what we know is wrong. But if you're in a situation where you have a lot of data, a lot of examples, You can have a dumb algorithm, but because the data signal is so strong, it forces it to do the right thing. And you see that, for example, the most obvious example of this one that hits you in daily life is when you type in your searches. You type in a search in Google or in whatever search engine you use, and you'll probably notice that, well, first of all, you get this predictive stuff where Google is trying to guess what are you typing. In fact, I'm particularly proud that we did that at Yahoo before Google did it when I was there. That was one of our achievements. But it turns out that if you look at the correction, the spell correction that's happened, it's not a dictionary-based spell correction. It's actually a statistical-based spelling correction that accounts for how often people make mistakes by typing the wrong way because of how the keyboard is laid out, either on the mobile or on a normal keyboard. More importantly, it automatically adjusts for things like slang and terms that a dictionary will have a very hard time sort of dealing with those errors. So a lot of the early search engines try to use dictionary-based. The algorithm was very much, I'll try to map that word to the nearest word in a dictionary. And that turns out to be absolutely the wrong thing, because that's not what people are doing. So that's an example where sort of learning from the big data gives you a much better product. It's not necessarily more intelligent. It's just much better at performing, because it will correct your errors much more effectively than a knowledge-based approach like a dictionary with a very careful algorithm that's designed, top-down to do the best possible inferences and all that kind of stuff. So those are great examples of new generations of algorithms that can do this, everywhere, while you're driving, while you're transacting, detecting fraud, detecting, intentional fraud, group fraud, all kinds of stuff will be possible. Of course, a lot of security applications, unfortunately, a lot of surveillance applications, something that we should all worry about. But all of these technologies have, their double-edged sword. They always have the dark side, and that's why we need the policies and the laws.
Usama, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work and connect with you directly?
Probably these days it's LinkedIn, and I have my website on open-insights.com or fayyad.com, Fayyad, and I'm always happy to connect. Very involved with the KDD conferences. I run the Applied Data Science Invited Talks track, and I encourage people to sort of track the postings I have on that, because it sort of gives you a feel for the latest hot stuff happening in applied data science.
Usama Fayyad, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into Rebank. If you like today's show, reach out. Follow us on Twitter at Rebank Podcast and join the conversation. For more on banking, fintech, and the future, check out our regular content at www.bankingthefuture.com.